lot of the good software hygiene that people have been advocating for years, configuration management, artifact versioning, it's really important that we're effectively eating our vegetables here.
Good morning and welcome to It's Fine, your go-to podcast for navigating the intricacies in the world of business strategy and technology trends. I'm your host, Matt Treiner, and this week we're diving deep into an often overlooked yet critically important aspect of cybersecurity, software supply chain security and best practices. In today's digital age, the software supply chain is the backbone of many businesses, yet is frequently overshadowed by the spotlight on vendor management. However, the integrity of the software itself is paramount to ensuring overall cybersecurity resilience. From development to deployment, every step in the software supply chain presents potential vulnerabilities that can be exploited by malicious actors. Joining us for this insightful discussion were two esteemed guests. First, we have Jessica Sweet, seasoned supply chain expert whose expertise lies in uncovering vulnerabilities and enhancing security measure within supply chains. And second, we have the privilege to have Dan Beller, the Director of Cloud Engineering at Hunter Strategy, who brings a wealth of expertise in robust security protocols and cloud-based environments. Together, we'll explore the critical importance of prioritizing software supply chain security, offering best practices to mitigate risks, and shedding light on why a proactive approach is essential in safeguarding against emerging cyber threats. So buckle up as we delve into the intricacies of software supply chain security, because here at It's Fine, we believe that when it comes to cybersecurity, it's not just fine, it's imperative. Welcome. Thank you guys for joining me this morning.
Happy to be here.
So to start off, just to kick off the discussion, what are some common vulnerabilities and risks associated with software supply chain, and how can businesses, particularly those serving the government, since that's a lot of what we're here to talk about, effectively mitigate those risks? Jessica, I'll pass it to you to start off.
Sure. So really in today's society, software is touching virtually everything, thinking about software systems to cars, to critical infrastructure, hospital systems that we are seeing today, big cyber attack. And there's really been this significant uptick in software supply chain attacks for a number of reasons. We're seeing increased attack surfaces, really reliance on third-party applications, account compromises, and so on. And while these software risks aren't particularly a new phenomenon, they're becoming increasingly more sophisticated, lucrative, and elusive. So it's making them really a lot more powerful and harder to detect. There's a number of kind of more prominent risks that we're seeing. One that really comes top of mind is insertion of malicious software. So we're seeing that kind of happen pretty consistently. A couple mitigations: one, compiling software into trusted locations to really serve as that logical central distribution point, such as code repos. We see that GitHub recently released a public beta of artifact attestations to really help simplify for provenance checks for their build artifacts. Another risk that we're seeing, vulnerabilities introduced from open source. That's a big one. And we know that an overwhelming portion of modern software code bases contain open source. It's really the bedrock of the software world, which has introduced a lot of benefits, but also a lot of new risks. So for that, we're seeing increased use of software bills of material, which we saw with the release of the Executive Order 14028 back in May of 2021, really promoting documentation for provenance and pedigree of parts, components, and systems, threat modeling. And I just wanted to say for SBOMs too, we're seeing the importance of that, not just for IT, but also OT and ICS as well. And then the last risk I was just going to touch on that we're seeing that's really common is the lack of overall governance and really enforcing traceability throughout the development lifecycle. So things like implementing CI/CD pipelines, to automate and establish that traceability throughout the build, test, and deployment of software.
Just to piggyback on that last point especially, it isn't exactly a new challenge as far as governance of software goes, but a lot of the good software hygiene that people have been advocating for years, configuration management, artifact versioning, really, it's really important that we're effectively eating our vegetables here.
Just to kind of dive into that a little bit, Dan, since I know you kind of get into deeper on the implementation side, what are some best practices that you can think of that are frequently overlooked in doing it? And then if you could even throw in why you think they're overlooked and what makes them, a challenge for people to adopt.
So I think one of the things that I've seen time and time again, especially on government contracts, we have this concept of a sprint zero when we're starting a new project. That's really our opportunity to set up the structure, the software factory, the CI/CD pipelines. That's a great time to add in a lot of the shift left type things. So your SAST, your software composite analysis, things like that. You want to really get the quality gates in there early and not try to add it later because it's going to be easier to deal with it early. And then, once you're getting really into things, you'll then be able to handle, the marginal updates as opposed to, oh, we've been developing this product for 6 months and let's go in and add in some vulnerability scanning now, and everything blows up and it just really messes with your velocity and your productivity. So I would say really going back to good hygiene, structure your pipelines early and add in those quality gates.
So one thing that, and this is a pretty specific and in the weeds suggestion that's made a lot, and I'm curious what you think of it, Dan, is localized repositories for externally open source maintained projects. And the example that always comes up in these conversations is the very famous left pad deletion from NPM many years back. Is that something that you see as kind of a sprint zero concept, just like the other ones of kind of setting up those local repos? Why don't people do it more often? I can't tell you how often I jump into a project and I'm kind of like, oh, you're pulling directly from the vendor and or the open source provider, and you have no kind of buffer in between. Why? And that happens a lot. So I'm curious what you think about that particular practice, why it's not done, and do you think it's a good practice, or it's just, maybe some people might call it gold plating?
So no, I think it's a great practice, honestly. And yes, it falls into that sprint zero construct in my mind. There are a couple of things that you're getting with that. One, you're getting some resiliency. So if you're trying to build and you're reaching out directly to the internet and a service is down, you don't have a cache necessarily. The other is that a lot of the proxy repository products out there have built in vulnerability scanning. So it gets back to you want to fail early, right? So that you can recover quickly. And you want to make sure that you're able to better handle that overall supply chain risk from pulling in open source, from pulling in third parties, and it just gives you a way of better managing that.
I also like to think of it as almost like forced governance. It's like people now have to vet packages if you have to update the local repo before it gets in there. And otherwise, it's kind of like, we just bumped all the latest versions because Dependabot told us to. So that's something that I think about a lot. So jump into the next question that we kind of had for thought here. How does the focus on vendor management sometimes overshadow software security itself within supply chains? Jessica, since you've kind of done a lot on the vendor management side, why don't we start with you?
Yeah. So, vendor management on its face, we're primarily looking at assessing and managing relationships with suppliers and partners, right? One of the challenges to this is time required to distribute, collect, maintain vendor self-attestations. This becomes extremely burdensome to the government, to organizations, particularly small businesses. And these typically don't adequately address the need for visibility into the composition of software products, including things like third-party libraries, components, and dependencies. Vendor risk assessments, they may prioritize business continuity or financial stability, regulatory compliance over software security considerations. So really identifying and prioritizing risk categories specific to cybersecurity, software security, it's such an important exercise for these organizations to go through. And that's something that we've done with a number of our customers as well.
So I think of Al Franken's book title, Lying Liars and the Liars That Tell Them, when I think about a lot of the vendor side of risk management, right? It's only as good as the honesty of the vendor. It takes an inordinate amount of time to manage, and there's just time is probably the most finite resource in cybersecurity. Time and talent. It's hard to say which one is more finite, but there's definitely the two most finite resources. Dan, I'm curious from an implementation perspective, how do you think about mitigating vendor-based risks and validating that, or balancing that rather, against the actual inherent risks in the software and the baseline and the infrastructure?
So one of the things that I've seen is that there's a tendency to focus only on the functionality of solving a specific problem when you're developing, and that there isn't a whole lot of necessarily thought around doing a little bit of due diligence when you're pulling in a new open source or a new third party solution. And that's an area that I think it's not the most exciting thing, but you get into developer training and really trying to build a security aware workforce. I don't think there are a whole lot of magic bullets here other than kind of the defense in depth and people being aware that, hey, maybe this random GitHub project that's got, like 5 stars, but does exactly what I need. Maybe I should keep looking still.
So, and I agree with you, especially on there. There are not really magic bullets on that. It's a time investment. It's a balance between what people are being told they get paid to do every day, which is build the thing, and then frequently secure the thing is thought about as a gate towards kind of completion or production. And that definitely ties back to your sprint zero aspect. But one of the more humanizing things, in my opinion, and I say this just like how I do with my children, scaring them with a story is remarkably effective. So what are some examples of software supply chain compromise and stories that can help get people to pay attention to their supply chain trainings and kind of ready themselves for that piece? Jessica, I'll start with you on some things that you can think of.
Yeah. I mean, 2021 felt like a big year. We had Log4j, Colonial Pipeline ransomware. I mean, really, I'm reading today even about this Ascension hospital cybersecurity attack that's pretty wild. I mean, it's diverting ambulances to other hospitals across the country. And it's really what I think is interesting is that these attacks, they're not just the guy in the basement anymore, right? Stealing data. These are actors who are really disrupting critical infrastructure and operations. So there's a lot of pieces to that. And I mean, again, even with this hospital case right now, they're reverting back to paper records. So the implications are massive. Those are kind of just a few off the top of my head. We know Cisco and MITRE, they've also been targeted and attacked. Most recently, MITRE, they had 2 zero-day vulnerabilities by a nation state. Cisco, they had a state-sponsored hacker deploy 2 backdoors. So, we're seeing definitely, again, like I mentioned, an upward tick in these types of attacks.
So, I really appreciate that because the ones that you hit on there really talk about impact, right? Like the human element and the human impact. And I'm going to say this a little tongue in cheek. Some developers care very much about that. That's going to speak to some developers in a really deep way. Other developers tend to be less connected with the impact and the human side as much as the development itself and kind of the art of their craft. And so, Dan, kind of curious if you can think of any examples that are just really kind of neat and interesting. Like you wouldn't have thought that this was the way in the door, and that happened. And I think sometimes that is again, not that impact is bad. Impact's really good. Impact's great to get executives, especially to give time to the teams to do this. So I think in addition to the developers themselves that appreciate the impact, it's great to the decision makers to give them the time to be effective. But when can you think about ones that really just help people that think that they're great at their craft realize, oh crap, I would never have thought of that one? So Dan, any of those come to mind to you?
So there was actually one that came up this week, and we've been seeing an uptick in attacking at the edge. So routers and security devices. Noticed, and I'm not singling it out per se, but Big IP's latest platform for managing all of the Big IPs has some complexity misconfigurations that are leading to vulnerabilities. Now we don't know; it's a little bit too early to know where whether there are going to be or have been breaches, but just getting back to the fundamentals, and you would think that, the most security conscious companies would be at the forefront there, and they are, but this stuff's hard to do. And there's just so much of it that you just have to remain vigilant. These are the kind of things that having automated checks early in the process, peer reviews, should be able to catch these things before they go out in a product.
And I can't tell you, especially when you look at things like Big IP or the recent Avanti and Fortinet type of vulnerabilities that were out there. I've had customers come to me and say, do I need a firewall for my firewall? Which is like, they're not trying to be pedantic. They're like, how do we mitigate the fact that turning off our VPN is just not an option from a business operations standpoint, but also the fact that any script kiddie that can repeat this vulnerability, because those TTPs were just out there. It wasn't like hard to reproduce in those cases. They were logic errors that let you bypass the notion of authentication. And people are just really struggling to figure out, how do I mitigate this when the core of my security infrastructure, the thing I bought, like the big IP load balancers, as the example you gave, Dan, when those can't be trusted, or those not can't be trusted, but when that trust gets brought into question because of an incident or a situation, it definitely shakes people to their core in ways where, again, can I put a firewall in front of it? Is there like a hammer that I can whack this with to make this better? And sometimes there is, and I'll say we've got some innovations on the Hunter side. We're trying to think of new and interesting ways to create mitigation tools, but sometimes there isn't. Sometimes it's just good hygiene and having, you mentioned before, Dan, defense in depth. When if everything is protected at your perimeter, then that's great until somebody breaches your perimeter. You got that GUI center, which is a big problem. One thing that I was thinking about here when it comes to supply chain security in general is, what role does cloud play in either enhancing the stance of an organization's supply chain with use of cloud, or is it complicating the concept of that? And I understand that's not a monolith. It's probably doing both. But Jessica, what do you think about how the movement towards cloud is changing the notion of supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing both enhancements and complications. On the pro side, we're seeing that these CSPs, the cloud service providers, they're providing a lot of tools that really help to automate, scale, build security into the software stack, which really does enable better traceability of code. We're also seeing a lot of these CSPs typically offer centralized IAM capabilities, encryption, threat detection, which is of course also attributed to more secure software supply chains. But in a way, CSPs do kind of muddy the waters and can complicate software supply chain security through really the shared responsibility models. I feel if the CRM, the responsibilities matrix, is not really shared properly, or if responsibilities are not clearly identified and understood by both sides, this tends to create confusion and gaps. We're also seeing cloud technology really leading to an increased attack surface, so meaning more resources to monitor. So that's kind of a few things that come to mind there.
And before I ask you ways to mitigate some of the complexity that you mentioned, Dan, I'm curious what you think about, one, if you could scorecard and give your reason as to, is cloud and net good for the complexity of your supply chain, or a net, I don't want to say bad, but like a net increase in complexity? Curious what your top thought is, and if you could qualify why.
I think it's exposing more complexity that's probably been there, but might have been the responsibility of an on-prem data center team, touch labor, getting software-defined networking, identity. These are kind of like big things that for a lot of cloud offerings, they would just inherit it. Now you're responsible for providing the end-to-end solution, almost like an appliance in a lot of ways, as far as the breadth of what you're responsible for. It just makes it so that your dev team needs to, I think, have a lot more understanding and insight into a lot more than they historically have had to.
Yeah, the blending of responsibilities in cloud has definitely made it really interesting for people to kind of keep up, right? Because it used to be, oh, I don't care about that. That's the firewall guy. That's the network guy, or whoever. And now it's kind of seen as, well, it's all software, so make it work. And if you're the development team, you're expected to know it all. That's a pretty big change. So what kind of best practices do we think of kind of mitigate this, as generally the world, everything is being cloudified?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing, as everything is more codified, that we are seeing some maturation from the CSPs as far as guidance, and especially we work in government and defense. So design patterns, accelerators, things that help you get to a best practice configuration quicker and easier. Definitely seeing some forward progress there, and that can really help your dev teams, and especially on a lot of the government contracts where the size of your teams, you're bidding against everybody else to try to provide the most for the least. Being able to leverage some of these best practice design templates really helps you get to a relatively safe configuration and not have to learn everything for the first time on the customer's dime. I will also say that a lot of the regulatory compliance packs and vulnerability scanning and some of the specific capabilities that we're seeing the Microsoft defenders of the cloud world, it's giving us insight and again getting back to the whole shift left philosophy a lot quicker than in traditional development.
Jessica, any best practices that you can think of that would help here?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to throw out my top one, which I think, again, I'm doubling down on SBOMs and really, again, having this, maintaining machine readable SBOMs to inventory libraries and frameworks. That's really going to help enable for timely patching and updates. One more, it may seem super elementary, but multi-factor authentication. And I really like CISA's catchphrase, prove it's you too. So just something simple, but not every group does.
Sometimes it's hard and we don't do the hard thing. So definitely agree there. I want to thank you both for taking the time to have this discussion. I'm sure we're going to have more discussions on supply chain security here on It's Fine in the future. So thank you both and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.